So let's go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining today to hear us present um, on our hybrid power plant annual report, the 2024 edition. This is work that was done by a collection of colleagues up here at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. You can see all of the names on this title slide. My name is Will Gorman, and I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I'm joined by my colleague, Joe Rand. And the both of us are going to tag team in terms of presenting a lot of the data and analysis that was compiled for this report. I will be taking first half, maybe the first 20 to 30 minutes, and Joe will close us out here. Just a few notes. This is the fifth time we have produced this report. So for those that are new here, don't worry, you don't need to have listened to us present this report. We will kind of explain all of the context as we go along. For those who have tracked this report over many years, you probably will see a lot of similar trends and storylines and data, but of course with updated analysis through 2023. Last point before getting started is that this work is funded from the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, specifically the offices of the Wind Department, Solar Department, and the Office of Strategic Analysis. So we certainly thank those folks at the Department of Energy for funding this work. But let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and maybe actually the last a little bit of housekeeping. This meeting is being recorded. Some of you probably heard that as I kicked off the recording. So this will be shared on YouTube either tomorrow or sometime this week. And so if you have to drop, or if you have colleagues that are not able to join that would be interested in it, this will certainly all be shared. And then all of the information that you see here is all public. So you can find this on our website. Everyone is going to be muted during this webinar. As well, you will not be able to write to everyone in the webinar chat. We can see the webinar chat, so if you have issues, let us know. Me and Joe can respond to those. But we want to direct all questions and discussion to the Q&A feature of Zoom. So hopefully you all can see that Q&A feature. Anyone can write a question. All other attendees will be able to see those questions, comment on those questions, and upvote those questions, as will we. And we'll hopefully have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of our presentation to go through any questions you might have. And if we don't get to all of the questions, we always try to follow up with the attendees. So just in terms of giving you a little structure about where we're going to go in this presentation, these three circles represent the three key components of this report. I am going to present first on operational hybrid plants and the hybrid PPA sample that we collect. That all kind of represents somewhat of the operational fleet. And then I will hand it over to Joe to talk a little bit more about the pipeline. And so this is the hybrid plants that we observe in the interconnection queues. All of this data is for projects as of the end of 2023. So that applies to operational plants as well as the interconnection queues. So that is our data scope. So any development that has happened over the last 10 months, that is not in scope for this conversation, but of course, this is an annual recurring product, and so we are continuously monitoring this space, but you won't see kind of the results of that monitoring until next year. Another point on scope, everything that we're going to be talking about today is related to co-located plants that pair oftentimes behind a single point of interconnection, different resource types, but we are not really able to distinguish between plants that are just paired behind a point of interconnection and plants that are actually integrated and controlled together. Some would refer to that as a full hybrid. We do have some data that reports on this distinction in CAISO in particular, because they make that available, that choice between these two different types of operational models. But it's not something we can capture universally across our data set. The last thing is we exclude virtual hybrids, as those are often smaller, often behind the meter, but also because they are not always necessarily paired behind a single common point of interconnection, and that really is the focus of our work here today. I'm not going to talk about this slide, but this is just to say, to show some of the high-level findings. And as we have reported really over the last maybe 3 years of this report, is that 2023 was another big year for hybrids, in particular, as has been the storyline for the last few years, solar and storage dominate. And so you can see some of the numbers on operational capacity on the left. You see some of the growth in the queues on the right. And the last point, which we'll get into a little bit later in the conversation, is that this growth has happened even though PPA prices have started to increase, or maybe some would argue because the demand for these types of resources have grown, we've started to see PPA prices increase for the subset that we are able to track from. And I'll go into a little bit more detail once we get to that section of the presentation. We did want to add a slide for those who are strong users of our data, or at least repeat users of our data, to distinguish what we have added that is new this year as compared to last year. The first thing is we incorporate some new data from EIA. There is new data in EIA 860, which now reports the primary use case of storage technologies. Previously, it was just reporting a list of storage use cases without identifying which one was the main use case. So we've integrated that into this report. And then we've also integrated data from EIA 923, which reports monthly battery charging and discharging data. And we can use that to study individual hybrid plants and how they're operating, as well as to calculate round-trip battery efficiencies of the battery fleet and think a little bit about degradation. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We've also done some work incorporating and summarizing capacity market rules for hybrids. I'm actually not going to talk about that on this slide, in this presentation. I encourage you all to review the public report. But we have collected, one of the colleagues, the co-authors, Anna Chet, on this report, collected a lot of these rules across all of the ISOs, and so we've added that. And then finally, in the interconnection section, Joe is going to present on the trend over time of projects choosing hybridization. In the past, we've always reported the aggregate amount of projects that have chosen hybridization, but we wanted to do a little bit of time trending, in part because of the Inflation Reduction Act, in part because of some of the interconnection queue reforms that have been happening that have provided perhaps an incentive or a somewhat disincentive for hybridization in the case of the IRA, providing a standalone storage tax credit. Could be seen as giving a stronger incentive for storage to not have to be coupled or co-located with hybrids. And so we wanted to do a little bit of time analysis. And so you'll see that a little bit later. All right, so let's jump in. As I said, the first section is going to be me presenting on operational hybrid plants that were online as of the end of 2023. Just because I know there probably are some new folks on the webinar, a note about methods and data sources here. Everything that I'm talking about in this section mostly comes from EIA 860's 2023 early release. There is a few amount of public announcements, FERC form data scraping that we use to try to do some limited spot checking corrections of EIA data and potential additions to EIA data. But the most of the data comes from EIA. Everything in this report is specific to power plants with greater than 1 megawatt of combined capacity. So just a note again on the scope here that this is, for the most part, utility scale plants. Certainly rooftop solar and storage is not within our sample here, but there are a few behind the meter plants that might still qualify under that sizing threshold that we include here. And so that's just one of the limitations, is it's difficult for us to separate for those that are above 1 megawatt between behind the meter or microgrid resources versus front of the meter resources. The way we identify hybrids is that they either have the same EIA ID, which means it's being reported and kind of co-located at a point of interconnection together, or in some cases through other regulatory filings and trade press articles, as I mentioned earlier. Again, this suggests co-location, but not necessarily co-controlled. We don't really have that information. A few other challenges, limitations here. The EIA ID does not identify all hybrids or co-located plants, so certainly we're probably missing some sample here, but we really do try to scour the internet to make sure we have tracked everything, but that certainly is one limitation. And then the last thing is not really a limitation, but it's just another note on scope, is that we don't include dual fuel or CSP units here if they use, since those use the same prime mover technology, so steam turbines. Our really goal here is to capture different capabilities of the fuel resources that are being co-located behind a common point of interconnection. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. So this is a table we report every year, not really because we think that our attendees can digest this in the 1 or 2 minutes that I'm going to leave this slide up, but mostly just to say that there are a lot of different configurations of hybrids and co-located plants that we track via this analysis. And so you can see the list here. This even excludes a few categories that had really de minimis amounts of capacity. But there's a lot of different pairings, and there's a lot of different reasons that we might pair, or these resources are being paired with each other. In total, across our whole sample, this is 469 plants that represent almost 50 gigawatts of generating capacity. There are 9.9 gigawatts, almost 10 gigawatts of storage found amongst this sample. That represents almost 30 gigawatt hours of storage energy capacity. So it really is a substantial amount of resources here when you talk about hybrids and you think about how much is operating across the US. But I think maybe the quickest thing that pops out on this slide is just the dominance of PV plus storage. This has been a trend, really for the last 3 years of us doing this report. Probably is going to be the trend going forward as well. But that category is really what is dominating the resource type, both in terms of overall generator capacity, but also with storage capacity. So on this slide, we just try to extract some of the more popular hybrids, and by popular, I mean some of the more hybrids that are more recently being developed, and compare and contrast them with some of the key metrics on the right. So you see that PV plus storage category pops out again, has the most capacity, as well as for both from the generator side as well as the storage side. Fossil plus storage comes in second, both in terms of number of plants, but also in terms of capacity. Though you see that there is less storage capacity being paired with the size of the fossil units as compared to the PV system. And you can see that most easily in this weighted average storage ratio metric, which basically says, so in the case of PV plus storage, that 54% means that for every 1 gigawatt of PV capacity, there's about a half a gigawatt of storage capacity. So much larger storage plants relative, at least to their PV capacity, are being paired in that PV plus storage category as compared to the other categories that we show here. There is also longer duration of energy storage on that PV plus storage category as compared to the other hybrids here. Though I will note that that fossil plus storage category has really ticked up over time. It used to be much lower in earlier iterations of this report, but it's almost ticked up on a weighted average basis to be aligned with PV plus storage. This was a chart we added last year, and I think it's kind of the most telling when it comes to really why we even started this report and why we're on this call today, for really, why hybrids have entered the conversation. And that's really because of the growth in the PV plus storage type. So this really is just a theme of my whole section. Honestly, a theme of Joe's section as well, is that really starting in 2020, there has just been a really rapid rise of that PV plus storage category. There is growth. You can see that a little bit over the last 3 or 4 years in some of the other categories. I think most notably fossil plus storage, and then a little bit of wind plus storage. But really, when we talk about hybrids, we're talking about a lot of different categories that basically have been flat over time. So nuclear plus fossil, just flat. I think, which makes sense. Not a lot of nuclear getting built today. But then really just a few categories that have seen pretty substantial rise in the amount of capacity over the last few years. So to now pivot a little bit to think about these results geospatially, I first acknowledge that this is quite a busy slide. Both the graphic is quite busy as well as the text, but the graphic is really just meant to convey that this is something that we observe in most parts of the country. And this also gives you a little bit of a flavor, again, of the different types of resources that we're observing, and that you can see in the different colors as well as the different symbols of projects. As with last year, Massachusetts continues to have the most PV hybrid plants, but all of these plants are quite small. You can see all of the orange circle bubbles in the top right of this chart. California is catching up, certainly, to the number of plants, where it has the second highest number and has certainly added more plants in 2023 than Massachusetts did. But importantly, all of the plants in California, the majority of plants in California, are quite large. So 30 of the plants of those 72 have PV capacities greater than 100 megawatts, whereas in Massachusetts, all of the plants have PV capacities less than 7. We saw a lot of activity in the Southwest this past year as Arizona added the most new solar hybrids in 2023 with 16. California, obviously, a close second. In terms of wind hybrids, they're relatively sparse when compared to solar. Only 3 new projects were installed in 2023, and those were all in Texas. And in general, Texas is just the dominant state in this space, where 8 of the 17 wind hybrids there have wind capacity greater than 100 megawatts. And then finally, the fossil hybrid plant category. This is mostly a similar continuation of the trend of last year. California still has almost half of the hybrids across the country. The next closest state only has 2. But this is a category that sees growth, and so we do like to pick it out when we present this report. So just another way to think about our geospatial results is to now aggregate things by either the market region, so thinking about the ISO, the main ISO regions, or the non-ISO regions, which we lump into a West category and a Southeast category. On the left, we're showing our favorite 3 hybrid types generation capacity. And what you can see here is really the dominance of California, the West, and ERCOT when it comes to PV plus storage, though with the Southeast certainly seeing a decent amount. And you also see that PV plus storage is just dominant compared to the wind capacity and the fossil capacity that we aggregate here. But when it comes to wind, the most is in ERCOT. And then again, when it comes to fossil, the most is in CAISO in the West. Turning over to the right, this is now focused on aggregate storage capacity. And what you see is that it is basically a similar trend. So I'm not going to repeat it here. But one interesting note is that across all of these 4 plant types, so including standalone storage, which is in addition to the charts on the right, CAISO has roughly equal amounts of storage capacity as all of the other regions combined, and almost double the storage energy capacity. So CAISO, the California region, is really dominating when it comes to storage amounts. Again, that's aggregating hybrid storage capacity and standalone storage capacity. So this is now diving a little bit deeper into a metric that I talked about briefly a few slides ago, thinking about the storage to generation ratio, that percentage fraction, as well as the storage duration. On the previous slides, I was focused on the weighted average, but it is useful to think about the distributions here. And that is what you see. On the left, you see that in the blue triangle, that's the data that I was reporting before. So for the PV plus storage, that's that 54% for every 1 gigawatt of PV. There's a half a gigawatt of storage capacity, but you can see that there's a wide distribution, and actually the median is higher than the weighted average amount. Meaning some of the bigger PV plants might have a little bit smaller storage capacity, is what that might tell you. But you can see that the distribution for PV plus storage is all exceeds the distributions for both fossil plus storage and wind plus storage. Turning to the right, we add on standalone storage to the chart just to provide another point of comparison to PV plus storage. And what you can see here is that the distributions of PV plus storage and standalone storage in terms of the energy to capacity ratio is quite similar. But PV plus storage actually has more energy capacity so therefore more duration, because when it's relative to its overall storage's power capacity than standalone storage. And then what you can see on fossil storage, I noted to you that duration, that weighted average duration did uptick in fossil plus storage. And that's in part because that is a weighted average. And so there's a particularly large plant that brings up that average quite large. The distribution still sits well below PV plus storage. And that is a similar thing for wind plus storage, just shorter durations of batteries that we observe. To focus just a little bit more on storage here and thinking about the time trend, last year there was a note by me that in 2022, standalone storage was starting to catch up in relation to the amount of storage that was paired with PV plants. But that trend did not kind of come to overpass things in 2023. So there was a lot of batteries installed in hybrid formation and PV plus storage formation. And so through 2023, PV plus storage plants represent roughly almost 50% of the battery storage capacity in the US. This excludes pump storage. So this is only focused on battery storage. And whereas last year it was only around 40%. So it actually gained on standalone storage. And it contains roughly 50% of all storage energy compared to only roughly 40% for the standalone storage capacity. And the last bullet here is just to note that there has been, and this isn't really news to anyone, but battery storage capacity has really been increasing across the country over the last 3 years. And you can see that, and that's true both in the standalone configuration and format, as well as in the hybrid format, and again, mostly in that PV plus storage category. So what are these batteries being used for? That's what we're talking about here on this slide. And this is a trend that has been that we've been observing, really through 2019. The trend being that historically, the earliest batteries that came online were mostly being used for grid services, with some smattering of other use cases, a little bit of renewable firming, a little bit of peak shaving, and very de minimis amounts of arbitrage and backup. Those trends for everything really but arbitrage have stayed the same. But starting in 2019, the operators of these batteries have started to suggest that arbitrage has become a larger fraction of the installed capacities use case. There has also been a little bit of an uptake in the renewable firming curtailment mitigation, but certainly not as dramatic as we see for the arbitrage use case. And this is a percentage of all storage capacity. So batteries both in hybrid form as in standalone storage form. In the report, we break this out by the different hybrid components. And so I encourage you all to take a look there. We break that out by their primary use case. And really the storyline there is that all of the resources basically have the same use case besides the same distribution of use cases besides the PV plus storage plant, which really has it's dominated its primary use case in the renewable firming curtailment mitigation. And we think a lot about that in terms of the capacity accreditation process that PV plus storage is trying to look for. So I have 2 more slides in the operational section. We did do some case studies this year, relying on that EIA 923 data that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. And so what you see here on the left is that data presented for the Blythe Solar Hybrid, which is located in the California ISO. And it's a solar hybrid. And then there's a wind hybrid located in PJM that we report. In the orange bars, this is the renewable energy generation amount. In the green bar, this is the amount the battery is charging. And then in the red amount, this is the amount that the battery is discharging to the grid. And so that allows us to, as I mentioned earlier, calculate the round trip efficiency of those batteries in these different months. And that is what you observe in the blue dotted line. So a few kind of interesting tidbits that I just want to point out that you can see in this case study text on the bottom right is that in the case of Blythe Solar, what you see is that the battery is cycling less than once per day. And the way we get at that is we know the amount of megawatt hours that is in the battery. And so this dotted purple line can give you a sense of its theoretical daily single cycle energy amount. And so you see that the green and red bars are below that. And this aligns with CAISO's wholesale pricing patterns and solar shifting, to counteract the impacts of the duck curve that everyone loves to talk about. And so that is one interesting tidbit that can be contrasted to the Meyersdale facility, which we see the red and green lines actually exceeding that purple line, which is suggesting that the battery is cycling on average 6 times per day and sometimes even more. And this aligns with that EIA primary use case and only use case that actually the operator reports here, which is the battery using frequency regulation, which aligns with this note that it cycles more. And so it's really interesting to kind of see how you can use this data to see how some of these plants are getting operated. And a final note here is that you see that the blue lines are not really going down over time. They're fairly steady. And so that suggests not extensive degradation, at least for these 2 plants. But that tees up this next slide, where we are able to basically look at plants reporting this data over multiple years to see how that efficiency, that round trip efficiency, is changing over time. A few notes and caveats here is though, even though on the left we're reporting up to 7 or up to 8 years of data, really, for those of you who are tracking the battery industry who know this, a substantial fraction of the fleet didn't come online until 2 or 3 years ago. So this is really a trend that we're going to want to watch over time. Our sample really declines by year 3 and 4. But we do observe a drop in the round trip efficiency over time, both for standalone storage as well as hybrid batteries. On the right, we are showing the distribution of plant year observations, just to give you a flavor of, rather than aggregated data, some of the distribution. And this is not over time. And these are annual amounts. And what you can see here is that these align, I think, pretty well with what is reported efficiency ratings in the industry, which is that between 75 and 95% over the years that we observe. We do observe some plants that have below 50% efficiency in some years. That could certainly be battery degradation issues or things like that, but it also could be data issues or issues related to operational strategies that these plants might be choosing. But there are some particularly low efficiencies that we observe in the data. Okay, so with that, I'm going to now spend maybe 5 or 6 minutes talking about hybrid PPAs. And note that this is exclusively focused now on the PV plus battery plants. And so we're not going to be talking in this section, at least, about other categories of hybrids. So in our data set, which we posted all of the data publicly on our website again, so encourage you can review the plants that we have and the prices for each of those plants there. But there's 105 PPAs coming from 10 states that total about 13 gigawatts of PV capacity and 8 gigawatts of storage capacity, corresponding to around 30 gigawatt hours of batteries. The sample is certainly dominated by California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Hawaii. So that's just a note that everything you see here is going to have a little bit of a bias to the Southwest, though we do break up Hawaii separately. So there you won't see the bias in that when we show some of the trends. Almost 70 of these 105 PPAs are for plants that are already operational, so they are online today. But 37 are for plants that are in development, they're being constructed, but their PPA was already signed, which is a common thing to get offtake before construction is commenced. And so that's just a note on a little bit of breakdown there. All right, so let's look at some of the trends. So what we are showing in each of these 3 graphs is the levelized PPA price, all normalized by the amount of energy being produced or proposed to be produced, or at least in the PPA, from the PV portion of the plant. So the distinction between each is the bubble area. So on the top left, that bubble area represents the size of the battery. On the top right, the bubble represents the size of the solar plant. And the bottom right represents the ratio between the battery and the PV capacity. And the reason it's useful to present those in these 3 different ways is because the price is incorporating both the solar cost as well as the storage cost. And so even though we're levelizing by solar, sometimes it's still difficult to know, well, how large is the battery? Because that obviously is going to impact the cost. And so we want to make sure that we demarcate that here. And so what you see here, and this is certainly a new trend, is that PPA prices have started to increase. Now, a little bit of a note on our sample. Obviously, we have less observations in 2023 and 2024 than we do for earlier years of the data. In part, that is because our data is a lagging indicator. PPAs are obviously very competitively sensitive, and the way that we get access to this data is they are either required to be filed, or they're required to be filed by some regulatory process, whether that's a FERC data reporting requirement or a utility commission data reporting requirement. And so by definition, that data doesn't get reported right when these PPAs get signed. And so we just always are a little bit lagging here. But at least for the observations that we have in these most recent years, the prices have gone up for the continental US sample, which is all of the dots that are in blue. Hawaii, you'll see, has always had PPA prices that are a little bit higher than the continental US. At this point, our data set is quite old, We don't have any more PPA prices really over the last 3 years, though we are hoping in future iterations of the report that we do get some of the PPA prices in this state, because we know that they are executing and have executed PPAs for solar plus storage more recently. In the past, one of the reasons, and you can see this in the bottom right chart, that Hawaii has been higher is because they typically have always had a PV to battery capacity ratio of 100%. So larger batteries relative to the solar amount is getting paired there. But that trend has somewhat changed, whereas in 2024, a lot of the continental US plants we have PPA data for are also in that 100% category range. And then finally, a note on storage duration, because that obviously affects prices here too, is that the majority of our sample, and certainly in the recent years, are all 4-hour duration batteries. But we do observe some other durations. And then lastly, on the PPA sample, we did want to report some of the data where we are able to extricate or extract the portion of the cost that is just due to the storage. And that is useful for folks so that we can start to observe some storage pricing. And again, there's 4 charts here. So we're presenting the data in 4 different ways. On the top left, we're presenting it on $1 per megawatt month of storage. Top right, $1 per megawatt hour stored. So that normalizes things by the duration. And on the bottom left, normalized by megawatt hour PV. And what you can see here, similar to what I was talking about on the previous slide, that we do observe costs going up. I will note, though, that it is not just the storage component of costs that is driving the PV hybrid PPAs going up. We do observe some slight increases for standalone PV PPA prices and some of our other data products, but certainly the storage piece is driving some of these trends. And I think just for the sake of time, I'm going to now transition over to Joe. Happy to answer any questions during the Q&A portion of the conversation. But Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Will, and great job covering a lot of material there. So in the next set of slides, as Will said, we're going to focus on this kind of longer-term development pipeline for hybrid plants. And these data, as we mentioned, are drawn from transmission interconnection queues from grid operators across the country. Now, those of you that follow Berkeley Labs' work on interconnection queues might be familiar with our queued up report, and some of the material here in slides will be familiar, but there's also some new nuggets in here that are specifically focused on hybrids. But very quickly, I'll just mention what are interconnection queues for those who may not be familiar. Basically, this is the list of interconnection requests or projects that have submitted requests to connect to the electric grid, but are not yet built. And so these proposed projects are undergoing a series of studies to understand their potential impact to the grid system at that specific location. So the neat thing is they give us kind of a unique insight into what types of plants are being proposed and where they're being proposed. So it's a little bit of a crystal ball there. Next slide. So just quickly, we collect these data from all 7 of the independent system operators across the US, and also 44 non-ISO balancing areas, representing a very large fraction of kind of the installed US electric generating fleet. I want to be clear that these, again, are really just focused on the bulk power system or transmission level connections. So we're not looking at anything kind of distribution system level or behind the meter. And all of the data that I'm sharing, again, are just a snapshot through the end of 2023. Now, as Will mentioned with the EIA data, similarly with the Q data, it can be hard or imprecise to perfectly track down hybrid details. In some cases, we're doing some kind of manual matching of co-located plants, but in other cases, we have kind of specific hybrid details from the transmission operator in these data. So there is some manual effort here that goes on, and as such, we may have missed some hybrid plants. Finally, when it comes to any analysis we did on looking at storage capacity, I want to be clear that that was only provided in about half of the interconnection requests that we're able to analyze here. So in other cases, we sort of imputed or estimated those storage capacity values. And also, unfortunately, in these queue data, we really never have any information about storage energy or duration. So that is just not available for these analyses. Next. So here in this figure, we're showing the total capacity in gigawatts that we see active in the queues over time. So this is looking from 2014 through 2023, and then we've broken it out by generator or storage type. And you'll note that the total height of each bar represents the full or cumulative capacity in the queues as of that year, whereas the hatched portion that's shown in each bar represents the capacity in these various hybrid configurations. So in general, as I think you can see clearly from this chart, we're seeing pretty extraordinary growth in solar and storage in the queues over time. And just looking at, again, the hatched portion of hybrid capacity, we see, again, especially strong growth amongst, hybrid capacity for solar and storage. Next slide. Yeah, so just Will had sort of a similar table in his summary of existing plants. And so here we're showing all the various configurations of hybrid plants that we see actively proposed in these queues. And again, just like with existing plants, solar plus storage or solar plus battery plants are really dominant, both in terms of number and proposed capacity. In fact, we're seeing over 92% of all hybrid plants in the queues are that solar plus battery configuration. And also, again, a vast majority of capacity at over 575 megawatts just in that configuration. In total, we are seeing about 2,700 hybrid plants proposed in the queues, representing almost 670 gigawatts of proposed capacity. I also just want to note while we're on this slide, the year-over-year growth in these proposed hybrids taken as a whole or cumulatively. And so when we look at that total capacity of hybrids in the queues, that has increased about 33% year over year since the end of 2022. Next slide. So here, just getting into a little bit more detail about the hybrid capacity and hybrid configurations. The figure on the left illustrates the proportion of the total queue capacity for each of these resource types that is in hybrid configurations for these various generator types. So for example, on the far left, you can see of all of the solar capacity that we see in the queues that are active as of the end of 2023, about 55% of that capacity is proposed in some type of hybrid configuration. And then looking at the storage column right next to it, again, of all of the storage capacity that we see active in the queues as of the end of 2023, about half of that is part of a hybrid plant. Compare that to wind, where we just see a much smaller fraction, of about 14% of wind capacity is in a hybrid configuration. Now, turning over to the figure on the right, you can see really notable year-over-year growth in proposed hybrid capacity from 2020 to 2023. But the other thing you'll see on the right in the bullet points is just a little bit more of a breakdown on those various hybrid configurations. I've already mentioned, and I'll reiterate here, that solar plus storage is just by far the dominant configuration with 575 gigawatts. But again, here you can see kind of the smattering of other types of configurations that we see, whether they include wind or gas or other resources. Next slide. So yeah, another interesting thing with the queue data is that they allow us to look at some trends by region. And so that's what we've done here. What we're showing in this table is the fraction of the proposed capacity in these various resource types across the various regions, the fraction that is in a hybrid configuration. So for example, in the top left of the table, you can see in the California ISO region, 98% of the solar capacity active in the queues is proposed in a hybrid configuration. So yeah, again, just looking at that solar column, we do see hybrids representing over 20% of all solar across all regions. But again, extremely common in California ISO and the non-ISO West, with 98% and 81% respectively. Turning to the wind column, like we've said earlier, overall wind hybrids are just less common and more regionally constrained, I would say, is what we see from this table. But again, we see kind of primarily these wind hybrids are being proposed in CAISO and the West. And then I'll just jump over to storage on the right side of the table. I think we see a pretty large fraction of proposed storage capacity coming from hybrids rather than standalone plants in nearly all regions, perhaps with the exception of ISO New England and New York ISO. Next slide. All right, so Will kind of teased this slide when we were talking about things that are new in this iteration of the report. But we really want to look at these regional trends in hybridization over time, and that's what we've done here in this table. Again, I know this table is a lot to take in just the 1 minute that I'll be sharing it, but I'll try to just tease out what we think is kind of the key takeaway. Now, we were interested in this question to see if there was any effect from perhaps these countervailing forces. We're seeing increasing saturation of solar and other variable renewable energy across many of these regions, which might incentivize developers to pair their new generation with storage and increase hybridization. Similarly, we're seeing kind of these backlogged queues that might lead a developer to want to add storage onto their requests. On the other hand, as Will mentioned, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, that changed the structure of the investment tax credit and enabled standalone storage to be eligible for that tax credit, no longer had to be paired with solar or wind for eligibility. So we thought that might actually tamp down the interest in hybridization. So just looking over the past 3 years, we were kind of able to get at that question. And I guess what we're seeing is basically relatively flat or sometimes increasing proportions of hybridization requests in 2023. So just to kind of get at that main question, we're not really seeing any evidence that the Inflation Reduction Act has really dampened hybrid interest across the country at this stage. Next slide. Okay, so just a couple more things to note. It also examined the ratio of storage to generation capacity in these proposed plants. Although I should stress that these data were a little bit more sparse and not available for all interconnection requests, and certainly not for all regions. In general, we can see that the ratio tends to be higher in regions with higher renewable penetrations, like California ISO and the West, where in a lot of cases we're seeing that ratio of storage to generation hitting right around 100% or 1-to-1. The other thing I want to note and highlight while we're on this slide is that in many of these regions, the ratio for proposed projects is higher than that ratio for the existing projects that Will already highlighted earlier in this presentation. So basically, the takeaway there is that I think it's reasonable to assume that future hybrid plants that we see installed and built in this country will likely feature a relatively higher storage proportion compared to those that are already in operation. Next slide. Okay. One other interesting tidbit we were able to look at, and unfortunately here we only had data for the California ISO, but we were able to compare the total proposed hybrid capacity of these interconnection requests to the capacity limit at the point of interconnection, or POI. So that capacity limit, or POI limit, is basically the maximum injection capacity for that particular project or that interconnection request. The maximum it can export to the grid at any given moment at that location. So the way we're showing that in this chart is on the far left, we're looking at solar plus storage plants and that kind of combined capacity of those two resources together. How does that compare to the POI limit? And then looking at wind plus storage. And then on the right half, we're comparing just the generation portion of each of those hybrid configurations. So I think the key takeaway here is that the POI limit tends to be based on, I think, what we would consider the generator capacity alone in most cases. So just again, as an example, if you look at that solar portion only, kind of the third bar in, for hybrid plants in California ISO, it's typically at 100% of the POI limit. So this really to us suggests that these proposed plants tend to maximize their point of interconnection limit by using storage to supply power only at times when the solar or wind plant is not generating at full capacity. All right, that was a lot in a short amount of time. Let's go to the next slide. I think Will's going to just wrap it up for us, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joe. And thank you all again. I think in the interest of time, knowing that there are a good amount of Q&A questions here, I am not going to read out the conclusions, but suffice it to say that this slide summarizes a lot of what me and Joe just talked about. And so maybe as we go through Q&A, if you want to review that, feel free to do so. But I'm going to jump in and take a few questions that I think are related to some of the material that I presented on, and then I'll pause and turn things over to Joe if he wants to take a few that were based on his presentation. So the first one that I want to reply to is there's a question about what do I mean when I say fossil plus storage. And in the data that we release online, I think I actually do specify the prime mover of that fossil unit, but I will just say here that the majority of those fossil plants are either natural gas combustion turbines or combined cycle turbines. None of that is coal, or I believe none of that is coal that's getting paired with storage. And there are a handful of oil plants that are also doing so. And just a note, one of the reasons we've seen that trend, or at least what we've heard, is why the storage is getting coupled with fossil. In part, it's could be to take advantage of some of the point of interconnection, so to use some of that spare interconnection capacity, as some of these plants are peaking type resources that might not be generating that often. But we've also really heard that there are some operational synergies to leveraging the flexibility of a battery plant to kind of minimize some of the wear and tear on a fossil asset or these natural gas assets. So hopefully that answers the question. I also now want to respond to just a few, maybe lump a few of these questions related to battery degradation. So one of the questions was about what's the mechanism for battery degradation to also impact round trip efficiency. So the way that we were presenting round trip efficiency was a distribution of plant year. And so that means that some of those observations could be for later years in the plant's life cycle. So it's certainly just a time-based, use-based point that I was making for the particular of the data that we were presenting on, given that we were presenting not the first year of operation in the distribution, but we were actually presenting the distribution over the entire sample. So hopefully that clarifies that point. Another question was about some of the different types of storage being used. So whether that's LFP, NMC, et cetera. We don't actually have great data on that. I think it could be certainly a gap that we should try to fill. My colleague, Anna, who actually led that analysis, messaged me that, and these probably were assuming as much, but these are all lithium-ion batteries, or those two case studies we presented were for lithium-ion batteries, but we don't know the underlying chemistry. But I totally agree with Evan, your question about potentially getting at that. To think about your second question, which I unfortunately cannot answer, which is commenting on kind of the optimal pairing of generation with storage there. And let's see, is there any other?
Well, there were some interesting ones about the kind of PPA price increases and trends there. I don't know if you have any reflections.
Great, yeah, I will reflect on that, and then I'll maybe pause and let Joe, you take some of the questions. So I think the most part, or the majority of my question, a response to this question, relates to the fact that our data sample issue is that, we are a lagging indicator, even though some of those PPAs we saw were signed in 2024. PPAs are not negotiated in a week. And certainly part of the trend here is that 2022, as we all know, saw a lot of supply chain constraints and there was a lot of inflation. And so some of our data, since it's a lagging indicator, is probably picking up some of those effects. I think one of the people who asked the question certainly made the correct point that 2024, I think battery prices are at all-time lows. We certainly have acknowledged that in some of our materials. And we'll see kind of how the PPA prices start to reflect at least the input costs for those technologies. But the last point I'll make is that PPA prices are not necessarily costs. PPA prices reflect supply and demand dynamics. So if there is a huge amount of demand for these types of resources, even if the underlying costs have gone down, the people supplying those products can potentially offer a higher price. So that's not, I'm not saying that that's an explanation for the increase, but just a note that PPA prices are a little bit more complicated than just taking in the raw material costs. Yeah, so maybe, Joe, I don't know if you see any interconnection related ones that you want to
Yeah, there's a few, and I guess just real quick, I will say we're not going to have time to answer everyone's great questions here, but Will and I will make an effort to follow up by email with any we're not able to answer. And Will and I are also pretty easy to find on the internet, and our email addresses maybe are on the next slide, but you can track us down, and we're always open to answering questions and discussing this work more. But the one I definitely wanted to touch on looked like a clarifying question on the interconnection queue data analysis. Would a solar hybrid plant be counted twice, once as a solar hybrid and once as a storage hybrid? And Will, if I could get you to scroll up a couple slides, maybe it's 23 or around thereabouts. Maybe go, yeah, here. Yeah, so I think maybe this is where that confusion might be coming in. And I want to be really clear that in terms of capacity, like we're showing on this chart, that would not be the case. So if there is, let's say, a solar plus battery plant, what we've done for this chart is we've taken just the solar component of that particular plant, grouped that capacity into the solar panel of this chart, and then for the storage component of that same plant, that capacity would go into the storage column. So they're not double counted here, although we are, I guess in that sense, we're kind of breaking apart a single request into its two component parts in terms of capacity. And then when we count the number of requests, again, we're not double counting those. We're just including those as individual requests or projects. But yeah, good question. Hope that clarified. Maybe I have time for one more on the interconnection stuff. There was another question about whether we track projects that drop out or withdraw from interconnection queues. Yes, we definitely do. And we don't necessarily know the reasons that they drop out, but we have some I think some insights that are useful there. And we've had a number of conversations with developers and anecdotes, but that's work that we want to do more in the future to understand the reasons for withdrawals. But encourage the questioner to check out the queued up report, another annual report, and other related analysis that our team does on interconnection. Let's see. Maybe we should wrap it up here, Will, or do you want to take one more? I think we're
I'll take one more just because it's on the PPAs, and then I will conclude. So if Sintu, you're still here, that levelized storage adder, the way you should think about that is in some of the PPAs that we track, they actually price the PV component separately from the storage component. And so we are actually able to just observe how much the off-taker is paying for the storage component. And so, I guess you could think about PPA price as a value, but I think we do, even though I said what I said earlier is that it doesn't purely represent the cost. It definitely represents the cost to people off-taking these products. And so that would be the cost of off-taking storage. Standalone storage could be different, but the reason we like to provide that data is just to kind of give a sense of the prevailing prices for storage capacity. Okay, it is 11. We're at the top of the hour, so I think I'm going to close. I know there are still a few more questions in the chat. We'll try to follow up with those separately. Thank you all for your attendance and having a lot of questions. That always makes this more engaging for us rather than staring at a computer screen and just talking to ourselves. So thanks again for the time. And again, this is all recorded. We'll post it on our website. And feel free to reach out to either Joe or I if you have any more questions or recommendations for future work. So take care and have a great rest of your Monday.